Right, good morning, everyone. Okay, so if we could go on to the next slide, please. What we'll be covering today is the handbook, the legal requirements you need to include or not include in a handbook, a complete full list of employment policies, how to create a policy. There will be a bit of a fun quiz just to test your knowledge. I'll then move on to induction. And what that means and how to introduce an induction program into your business and what an induction program should cover, and also the paperwork that backs it up. Like I said, if there are any questions, then please feel free to put them in the chat bar. I can cover them as we're going along, or there may be something very specific to you that I can pick up at the end. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. I would try to make this as interactive as possible, so there will be a few Slido poll questions as we go along. So if we can just move on, please. Thank you. Okay, so what is an employee handbook? It sounds a very basic question, but it is the most important internal communication tool to your employees you can have. Most people think it's this dusty old book you put on the shelf and it just covers a few rules and regulations. And a handbook is your opportunity as a business owner, as a director, as a manager, to sell your business and describe your culture, your values, your mission. That should be the fundamental part of a handbook. It should also detail employee benefits. And I don't just mean enhanced benefits. That could be statutory, as in sick pay, as in maternity and paternity. And of course, the compliance side of it. So there will be the bit around legislation. There will be a bit about standards and rules and general information, how you book holidays, company perks, what do you do if you're sick. So that's a whistle-stop tour of an employee handbook. Next slide, please. Question. So for my benefit now, how many of you actually have a handbook within your organization?
If you'd just like to scan the QR code on the slide of the screen, or go to slido.com and enter that number there, 3231284, and that will come up with the questions throughout today's session.
Okay, that's not too, slightly moving, not too bad. So basically 2/3 of you do have a handbook, 1/3 of you don't. So hopefully for those of you that don't have handbook, you may use today to find out how you can implement one and what the value of it will be. Those of you that do, there may be tweaks or enhancements you can actually make to what you currently have. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So question then, is a handbook a legal requirement? Do you think legally you have to provide a handbook to your employees? If you could do the same before, please. Oh, okay. Most of you are actually correct. By law, you do not have to have a handbook. However, there are certain things you must provide to your employees. If you have more than 5 employees, you must have a health and safety policy. If you have just 1 employee, you must provide them details on disciplinary, grievance, holiday pay and sickness pay, even if that's statutory, and any other paid leave. So although that's not a specific handbook, then yes, there are things that you do need to legally provide to your employees. I always say it's very good. It looks nice to have an equal opportunity statement. We would advise our clients to have something just to show that actually you value everyone and you are a diverse employee. Okay, next slide, please. One thing I will say is the difference as well that I should say is, although a handbook is not a legal document, an employment contract is, and many of you would have done our previous workshop with Victoria, and she would have gone through how you must give new employees an employment contract or a statement. A handbook isn't like that. You do have more freedom with a handbook, but once you write it down, that's when it starts to become a little bit more strict, and you need to start to follow the processes that you have written down. So if we look at the advantages, Yes, it provides information to your employees. It also protects your employees from discrimination. So a handbook will, and the details of the policies, they will stop you just being able to do what you want to do. Okay, it sets the standards and expectations. So if you are expecting your employees to give you 2 weeks notice to book holiday, then that detail will be in there. If you want to tell them that they can only have lunch breaks at a certain time, that allows you to tell the employees of the standards you set. Likewise, if you had dress code, your code of conduct, your expectations, all of that should be in there, and it tells the employees as a director, as a manager, what you are expecting from them. Consistency. This is a difficult one. Particularly when you're a small company, there will be employees that I always call more of like good eggs. They are your better employees. They give you the extra mile. Unfortunately, you can't treat them differently because you play golf with them or you value them more. Having a handbook will ensure that you are consistent in your treatment of your employees. It will also ensure that you meet legal obligations. There is legislation out there, and there are certain minimum standards you must provide to your employees. It's central, everyone knows where they can go. It also looks good and it looks professional to have a handbook. Hopefully, it should keep you clear of tribunals. The most important thing is that once you have a handbook and you've rolled that out to your employees, the liability when there's problems shifts to the employee. By you not having one and not communicating one, there is more liability with you as the employer than with the employee. The minute you have one and you've rolled it out, it shifts over to them. Okay, doesn't make them totally responsible, but it definitely moves the balance. We had a client that joined us, and I will give you a few of these case studies as we go along, who had an employee who was underperforming and they wanted to dismiss him. So they came to us, they said, can you just get rid of the employee? They're a poor performer. So my first question to this new client was, what policies and what handbooks you have in place? Nothing. That makes it very difficult for us in HR when you have nothing. Depending on what they've done, there's certain standards that will come from ACAS, but with things around performance, for example, there are no standards. So you start with a blank sheet of paper. This employer didn't know where to start. He didn't know what the law was. He didn't know how other people had been treated. He didn't know what was fair. All these things are advantage of having a handbook. It will give you that information. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, many of you say, well, okay, if you've got advantages, what are the disadvantages? You need to make it interesting enough for employees to read. It sounds really basic. If you have a whole encyclopedia size of a handbook, people won't read it. I'm not going to lie to you, it is time consuming to create and to keep updated, but the value of having it far outweighs the time you will put in to keeping it up to date. It will create many problems, a lot more problems, if the managers don't adhere to it. You will then become more liable in a tribunal. So it's great to have processes and standards, but by not following it, it does give added weight to an employee should they go to tribunal, because it can increase the payout charges for someone if you have standards and you choosing not to follow them, because then it can become more of a discrimination case and enhance problems that way. Some managers will say it removes the opportunity of discretion. I'm all for discretion and grey areas, as they say, as long as you are treating people fairly. No two cases are ever the same. So yes, you must have discretion. It does not remove the full amount of discretion if policies and handbooks are written correctly. The biggest problem is some employers want to put everything into it, line after line after line, and you do not need that amount of detail, because the more detail you put in, the more you must follow it. And if it's not written correctly, it can be quite hard to interpret for managers. So I would say the most important thing is not to write pages and pages. You do need some detail in there, but it needs to be quite simplistic. I'll also ask a question, I'll ask this in the chat bar. Does it matter if you have a handbook and then you don't issue it so your employees never read it. Is that a big deal breaker? I'll just see if a quick answer comes in on the chat bar. Correct. Yeah, it is. Thank you for that. It is a problem if you have a handbook and then you don't roll it out, and the employees don't have visibility of it. It will cause you a lot more problems, and I will come back to some of those problems in the future. I'll give you another example of a case study and why you shouldn't worry too much about the amount of detail. This is a true real life story that there was a Christmas party. They always cause us problems in HR, and obviously involved quite an amount of alcohol. And the client in question had shared accommodation. So a number of employees were staying overnight because they travelled across the country. Male and female had their own rooms. One of the senior managers at the party had drunk far too much, went into his room, fell asleep, woke up in the night, and then wasn't dressed. It was completely naked. He then went into the wrong room and got into the bed of a female employee by accident, but obviously still under the influence of alcohol. Obviously, the female employee did push him back out the door, did raise a complaint. And when we held the investigation, the manager's defense was, it doesn't say anywhere in the handbook or the policies that I can't do that, which I did find quite laughable, to be honest, because like anything in law, it doesn't say you can't ride a bike naked down the street, but common sense prevails. And that's what I try to say. When you are creating handbooks, when you are creating policies, sometimes you just have to use common sense. You would never write in a policy, in a disciplinary, you must not get naked and get in someone's bed. That is just ludicrous, but there is common sense of what is morally right and morally wrong. So unfortunately, in that case, his defense didn't actually weigh up, and yes, the disciplinary did go ahead. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so what makes a good handbook? So we want something that's informative. We want a lot of policies in there that apply to staff for years to come. You don't want just something that's going to be live and great for a couple of weeks. Obviously, as you know, the world of COVID changed us, and the amount of policies that now in place that were not in place 2-3 years ago are immense. Obviously, with COVID, we had to create a lot of quick policies, which were short hits at the time. But 3-4 years ago, the amount we wouldn't have had the in-depth homeworking policies, for example, that we have now. They need to be easy and enjoyable to read. Please don't put lots of jargon and sentence in there. Use it simple. The most important thing is it must be right for your company. The handbook must sell your company. You know, don't just take one off the Mr. Google, off the internet, and use it as a template. This handbook is selling you and your company and what you want to get to your people. It must be right for you. It's great if you have pop-ups and all these things, but if that's not your company culture, then why do it? Pages of text, yes, a bit boring, but it needs to be fun and light. But just think of your audience and think of your culture and think of your actual business. So, for example, I would expect a media type company to have a very different handbook than a car company where most of the employees can't actually access computer and don't use computer. They will have more of a paper-driven handbook, whereas media one might have more of an interactive one. It's got to be what fits. I would also ensure that your handbook at some point is interlinked with your company induction program, and it must be accessible. Now, you cannot use the defense that it was online somewhere and the employee should know where to find it. That would not stand up in a tribunal. You need to be able to make sure people can access it and are told where it is, primarily in induction, but obviously for more existing employees, they need to be told whether it is on the shelf, whether it is a click app or a tool or files. It needs to be obvious and easy to access. Okay, so next slide, thank you. Oof. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to policies. Obviously, some people will say, what's the difference between a handbook and a policy? And people will write them very different ways. A handbook often will incorporate all your policies, or you could just have some standalone policies. I've seen handbooks with 150 pages in because it includes everything. I've seen other clients that just have 3 or 4 policies. It's what I call like a starter pack, a mini handbook, which are the bare essentials that comply with legislation. So there's no hard or fixed rule of what it needs to look like, but the aim is with policies, they are there to protect the rights of the workers, but as well as the business interests of the company. So people say, well, what do you actually mean? So you need to ensure your workers aren't discriminated against and they are treated fairly and equally, whether male, female, old, young, whatever background, whatever religion, everyone must be treated equally. But there are policies in place there to protect the owners. Okay, so I'll give you an example of a case study we had where a client had a number of senior staff and they all resigned on the same day. There were about 4 of them that resigned on the same day. It doesn't, take a genius to work out something's going on. So I think they were doing, might have been a month or 2 months notice. Anyway, it came to light that they were resigned, but they actually were all going to set up their own company in competition with their current employer. So the current employer found this out, and as they were all working their notice period, they started to do a bit of research on what these employees in question have been accessing, and they had a policy, an IT policy, which allows you to view what employees have accessed, what they've downloaded, and it came to light they downloaded all of the pricing, all of the client's details, all of the files have been put onto either hard drive or sent by email to all their home addresses, etc. Now, they wouldn't have been able to do that without an IT policy. So this is where the business interest comes into it. What resulted in that there was a wealth of information, and all 4 employees actually got dismissed for gross misconduct while they were working their notice period. And not only that, it was such a serious case of information they'd taken, it then went to solicitors and a legal case was taken against them because of all of the IP that they'd taken. So you can see policies work both ways, but for you guys who are probably mainly business owners, there are policies out there to really protect you. You like to think, particularly when you start off a small company, your employees are all great and the world's wonderful, and quite often you employ people who are like-minded like yourselves and are really supporting the growth of your business. As you grow, sometimes then problems do occur, people change, and this is when you do need the policies to help you, because if someone stops performing, or if someone's being late all the time, or they've got attitude, this is when you need the policies to manage, unfortunately, when situations go wrong. So I think did a question just come up then? Sorry, as I was talking, Anna.
Emmeline just pointed out that the story that you just told, also there would be a lot of GDPR issues with that as well.
There would, and you would be amazed at companies that still don't have a GDPR policy. So GDPR came in 3 years ago now, and we've taken on a client recently with a number of staff and they don't have a GDPR policy. That's quite a biggie when you do it. So yes, the GDPR did, but it was the fact that the IT policy allowed us to search what they were looking at and what they were accessing, what downloaded. But you're correct that, obviously data, confidentiality, they're interlinked. Policies quite often, there will be an overlap and an interlink. So you need to make sure that they actually work together and they don't contradict each other. So going back, so like I said, the policies are also a connection between the values and what happens every day. So your values could be that you're great, you're team working and you treat everyone equally, but obviously then how does it come to holiday booking, who gets priority? It's the more the nitty gritty of here's all the top level stuff, but how we actually work day to day. There's transparency and expectations. Amazing that the people that deny things when they're not written down and they say, well, I didn't know that. This is where your policies come into great wealth, obviously, except for the guy who wanted everything in it. Policies often fall into 3 categories. The beginning of employment, so there'd be a bit around the recruitment and when you first come in and your induction and your health and safety, while the employees are with you. So to ensure that there's no harassment or there's no bullying, etc. And then when they leave, and that could be redundancy, that could be dismissal. So it tends to be the beginning, the middle, and the end. Roughly, a policy should fit somewhere under one of those three umbrellas. I would say, please don't just create a policy because a situation has happened. So we have experienced where an employee misinformed a customer, and it cost the company a bit of money. And the employer's reaction was, let's write a policy to say that they'll be liable and that we can claw back money from them. And we were like, well, is this the first time it's ever happened? Yes, but you don't know the reasons for why it's happened. You can't just say to your employee, well, you've cost me money, I'm now going to claw that back from you. There's investigation. So don't knee jerk with policies. There is places, but just because the situation's happened, don't automatically think you need to create a policy to rectify that problem. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so there you go. That is a pretty much full list of policies. Okay, so there may be people who've experienced odd ones that aren't there, but this probably covers 99% of situations that happen in the workplace. There may be some that are company specific that aren't on there, but there's a big list there. And I would say when we take on a new client, probably they opt for about 80% of them, which are specific. So I think we have a Slido poll now, don't we? So I don't know if you may need to flip to help the people or keep it on the page. So have most people heard or experienced all of these policies? If you could, is it possible to flick back for 1 minute, just let them have a quick look? Thank you. And then. Okay, so have most people heard or experienced these policies? Oh, good. Perfect. Okay, so sorry, could we just flick back to that full list again, please? A question for the chat box. Are there any policies in there that anyone hasn't heard of and just wants me to quickly explain? No. Okay, menopause. Yep. So the menopause that's quite a hot topic at the moment, because obviously you know, most women will go through that. What it actually says that is, as a company in this particular one, that you understand that someone's health may change, they may have more sickness, but there are support tools and you'd understand it, and there may be reasonable adjustments that you may need to make to help women who are going through that at a particular time. I think what they're trying to say is that actually it's not a taboo subject, that you are welcome to discuss it. There are support services out there, and there are ways that you would actually like to support women through this particular period of their life. So there is not set rules. It can be worded how you want, but I think what they're trying to do is make it more of an open topic. So if someone is suffering, and some women do obviously are quite poorly during this time, that actually you are open to discuss it and look at it and try to support them.
Could you also go into the lone worker policy, Rachel? Okay,
yeah. So lone worker policy. So some of you may be working from home. Some of you may have a work in a shared office. So this is quite relevant where you have more of a large office block, which is shared by a number of companies. So you may have a particular floor in a block. And what we say is that if they're the last person in the office, then really you need to ensure that, one, they know all the basics of the lockup to keep the office safe, but also that their own personal safety is there. So if there is a problem in the office, if they suddenly got taken unwell or there was an issue or someone come in, what they could do, who they can contact. So this is about ensuring really the safety of the last person that could be in a shared office at the end of the day, or likewise, if they are the one who arrives very early in the morning, depending on what shift patterns you do, it's about the health and safety of an individual working alone. Or it doesn't need to necessarily be in an office. It could be someone who, we have clients that have the garages, so it could be a lone worker. Then obviously there could be other forms of accidents, etc. So it's just protecting that individual. Any further before we move on? Okay, so what I've done on the next slide is I've categorized these into 3 chunks. On the left are the legal ones. They're legal because there is a lot of legislation which must be followed with how you treat employees under this. So quite often you will find things around ACAS that will follow this, and I can go through them. The middle section are the ones that if I was taking on a new client tomorrow, I would say to my client, you must have everything in the left column. I would recommend everything in the middle. The ones on the right purely depend on the size of the organization and if it's relevant for you. It doesn't mean they're any less important. It doesn't mean that you don't add value to it, but they carry a different weight than some of the others. So, mental health is obviously on the right. There is not really legislation under there. There is under sickness and absence, but not purely under there. Doesn't mean you don't give it any credit. It doesn't mean you don't value it. It just means that these are more nice to have. And of course, yes, you can still have them. Does anyone have any concerns or questions about how these are being categorized? No. Is anyone surprised by any of that? Anti-slavery, anti-bribery. Okay, I think, I'm assuming it's because it's a nice to have. Anti-slavery, it sounds really odd that tends to be more for a specific occupation. So you tend to see that more in agricultural, more so than offices, because it tends to be where there are immigrants that are being used and not paid properly and not treated properly. So it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's quite, for most employers or clients that we deal with, it's not a relevant one. Anti-bribery, yes, it can be a big one, but you could deal with that under disciplinary, obviously. But anti-bribery also, it depends if you've not got clients where you can have the opportunity to make money, take money from them, or give them favors or anything like that, then sometimes that's not as relevant. Capability policy, do you know what? That to me, that is one of the most important ones, and most people don't have it. It may be that you call it performance management. So to me, performance management and appraisal is when you perform your employees and you give them performance management and you take them through targets and you enhance them. Capability is the negative side of performance management. So I would say when you have someone who's underperforming, and that's why I often call them different things, an underperformer, you would then take through a capability process. If you research capability through legislation and through ACAS, there's very, very little legislation that covers it. Why we really try and push this policy is because if you do have underperformers, you need to manage them with very strict criteria to ensure that you can eventually, if it does come to this, dismiss them legally. Some people will try to manage poor performance through disciplinary. I think it's very different than disciplinary. Where capability, you need to determine if it's a fact of someone who can't do their job or if they won't do their job. Won't is where it comes to disciplinary. Can is sometimes because they haven't had the training, they've been promoted too quickly, they're in the wrong role. It's all got to be really managed very, very differently, and that's what that policy covers. Sorry, a couple more flew in as I was talking. I didn't catch them, sorry.
Oh, that was just a follow-up regarding the capability policy.
Fine, thank you. Okay, is there any other questions about anything on here before I move on? No? Okay, so how many of you have ever written a HR policy before? Okay. Okay, so, okay, 60% of you have. So obviously policies, most people go, where do I start? If we can move on to the next slide, please. It is quite difficult to start from a blank sheet of paper with a policy. Some people will use where they've worked previously. Some people will use their good friend, Mr. Google. There are lots of ways to do it. This is a summary, and obviously it is quite a brief summary because it's very difficult for me to just explain in 5 minutes how to write a policy. The most important thing is to understand what you want from the policy. This sounds really daft. So for example, if you were writing a policy on absence, okay, do you mean just sickness absence? Do you mean unauthorized absence? Do you mean approved absence? You need to actually, I almost start with a blank sheet of paper and just summarize and just brain dump, what do I actually want from it? Then look at all the information's out there. So the first thing is there any legislation which is going to affect your policy? Are there certain laws and rules that you must comply with? So for example, a disciplinary policy, you can't just write your own. There are certain things when you hold a disciplinary meeting or an investigation, you must comply with to keep you safe as the employer. So gather that information and understand legislation, see what's best practice. Think about what you've done previously, what's worked well. When you've worked in a previous company, was there something that you really hated? Was there something that worked really well? Doesn't mean it's always going to fit with yours, depending on your culture, but it's something to consider. Then start to write it, and it will be a bit of write it, scrap it, write it, scrap it. I also would say that if there are internal stakeholders, please get them involved at the development stage. By stakeholders, they are ones that it may affect. If any of you have trade unions or employee representatives, you will need to consult with them. You cannot just roll a policy out. Okay, some of you are probably not large enough to do that, but when I've worked for corporate companies, that's when it does become really difficult, and you will probably have a little bit of a battle with the trade unions. Hopefully none of you have that problem, but also make sure that it works from the top down. So there's no point creating a policy if you're not going to use it. It can't be used because it's too difficult to implement and you haven't got the full buy-in all the way through. Once you've got to the point where everyone's on board, everyone agrees it, implement it and communicate it. You've got to roll it out. You've got to use it. So they need to be written in quite plain language, not lots of jargon, not lots of short words. It's got to be quite simple, okay? And please don't assume, if you've joined a company, don't assume that the policies that are in place are always the right ones. You do need to review, do need to look at, actually, do they still represent what culture we want in the company, what values we still have in the company? Don't be afraid to change policies. Okay, next slide, please. Things to avoid. Like I said before, policies do interlink, okay? So for example, there will be ones around bereavement leave that could link in with emergency leave. There are often linked into, earlier we had GDPR with intellectual property and contracts. Don't either let them contradict, and I have seen policies that contradict, and please don't let them work in complete isolation, because at the end of the day, policies are about the whole of the company. Okay, use words so they cannot be misunderstood. Don't remove all the areas of grey. People say, what's grey? So I'll give you an example of grey. I've seen a policy where it said, if you have 3 periods of sickness in 1 year, you will be face a disciplinary. It's not that straightforward. So we have employee A who had 3 1-days of sickness, and that was due to migraines. Then we've got employee B who had 3 1 weeks of sickness for no reason, cough and a cold. let's just say, for example, so we've got employee A's had 3 days off in a year, employee B's had 15 days off in a year. By writing your policy to say 3 periods of sickness in 1 year, you then have to treat them exactly the same. I wouldn't treat them exactly the same. This is where you can allow discretion, and you also need to find out what the underlying reasons are. So you must be very careful with what wording you use. In the absence policy that I use, I tend to say, if your absence is of a level that is causing concern to management, then you may be investigated and may have to have a discussion about your absence levels. Use the word may, it gets you out of jail a lot of times, because may allows you to do what you want. Because I would also say, for example, if someone had unfortunately been diagnosed with a very serious illness, and so their absence suddenly went very, very high, you wouldn't automatically want to put someone like that into an absence disciplinary, because obviously their personal circumstances, you need to treat every case individually. Okay, I've also experienced policies where they've gone into so much detail, like you will receive a letter within 48 hours. The outcome will be given in 2 days. We will not suspend you for more than 3. So much detail that it just removes the grey. Grey is what I call discretion, and discretion is important because sometimes you need it if you're extremely, extremely busy, if there are other pressing issues, if you want to do a proper job. Please don't fundamentally put the policies into step by step by step, which doesn't allow you to have a little bit of wiggle room. Obviously, you can't be unfair and you can't discriminate, but you need to have flexibility. Obviously, I said before, don't create an isolation from key stakeholders, and never put it on paper, but then not in action. And a reactive policy, like I explained before, something's gone wrong, let's write a policy on it. Try to think what you might need in advance. Okay, so I believe we've got a question. How often do you think employment policies should be reviewed? Okay, well, I'm pleased no one has said the last two. There is no hard and fast rule. My recommendation would probably be biannually, purely because annually is very time consuming. Obviously, if there was a legislation change on a biannual, you would do it earlier, but more often than not, that is a lot of work to do annually. I would say biannually would still keep you up to speed and up to date and keep you quite safe from tribunals and from potential claims. If you've got time to do it annually, fantastic. If you haven't, don't panic. I've seen probably the worst ones I've seen. I've been given handbooks that were 9 years old and not updated and not reviewed at all in that time. Okay, next slide, please. So, like I said, the next steps, you've written your policy. It's all there ready to roll out. So once you have your policy or your handbook, if it's a huge handbook, that's fine. If it's brand new, if it's just one single policy, most important thing is to roll it out to the employees and get them to sign. I don't care what it looks like, to say they have read and understood it. We use a template which will list the name of either the policy or the handbook, and you can do a group signature. That's absolutely fine, which says Joe Bloggs signed, I have read and understood the following handbook or policies. Once you've got that, you can just file it or scan it onto their personnel records, and I'll come back to you why that is important. So once they've signed, sorry, is anyone else? Oh, someone's slides are stuck. I might have to let you, I will keep talking and hopefully you can work that one out. So once they've signed for it, please follow the process. It's a big fail and a big problem in the tribunal if you have a policy and you don't follow it. For example, if you try to dismiss someone and you have a disciplinary policy and you don't follow it, even if they have done something wrong. So for example, there was a case, a legal case, not one of mine, where there was a fight between two individuals. And when it is investigated and they did dismiss these individuals because they didn't follow their policy, they raised it at a tribunal claim and they actually won wrongful dismissal because the policy wasn't followed. So wrongful dismissal, even if the individuals have done something and it's still proven they've done something, if you did not follow your policy correctly, they do have a claim for wrongful. So please be careful. Once you start to follow the policy, if you have any changes, obviously make them, update them regularly. We did have an employee in one of our clients, when we took him into a disciplinary, his argument was at the time, I've never been shown that policy. I didn't know it existed, so I can't be in a disciplinary because I didn't think I'd done anything wrong. What we found on his employee files was the signed piece of paper to say he'd read and understood it. So when we brought out the sheet of paper to say, well, you've read 18 months ago to say you read and understood the handbook and the policies during your induction, he said, well, I didn't actually read it. I just signed a piece of paper, so I couldn't remember. Unfortunately, that didn't really help him, and that was a big fault on his side. It is quite common practice. People do sign and don't read it, but unfortunately he signed to say he read and understood it. If you need to make a change for a policy, and I'll ask this in the chat bar, do you think you need to consult with anyone to make the changes, or do you have to have involvement? Do you have to have agreement? What do you think you can do? Let's just say you want to make a major change to your absence policy. Can you just do that?
We've had a few yeses and a few nos.
Okay, so I will say with policies and handbooks, you do not need to consult. They are very different from a contract of employment. With a contract of employment, you try to change that, you need to consult, usually a minimum of 28 days. With a handbook, because they are not legally binding documents, you can change them unless you were doing something discriminatory to your employees, but you can make changes as long as it doesn't affect what's in their contract. You can make changes to the standards and the way you work things. So for example, if you said previously it said you must phone by 9 o'clock if you're going to phone in sick, you want to change it to 8 o'clock, fine. You don't need to consult on those changes. You can just make those changes and roll them out. And that is where handbooks and policies are fundamentally very, very different from contracts of employment. Okay, so how about if the employee handbook forms part of the contract? Yeah, so it depends on what's written in there. So if there is something that's in the handbook, which is also in an individual employee's contract, then yes, it does. But usually I try to keep the two different. Someone's employment contract is usually very personal to them. So for example, if it says you get 25 days holiday, you couldn't obviously reduce that. But as policies are mainly about the way of working and things like that, you can change all of those things. That's absolutely fine, but not if there is something that is written in their contract of employment. So let's have a go at this. I will whistle stop through this. Anyone know what policy would deal with an employee complaint? So an employee needs to complain about something or raise an issue, a formal issue or complaint. Grievance, perfect. It is a grievance policy. Who can act as a support companion in a disciplinary? Another colleague, correct. Another employee or union rep, correct. If you are under the age of 18, it could be a parent. It cannot be a friend. We've had someone who's a friend, who's a lawyer, who's a solicitor, can't do any of those things at all. Are all employees entitled to statutory sick pay? Ooh. Ooh. Ah, okay. I reckon there's no answer. Nothing's come through? No?
No, nothing's come through. I think
Okay.
you've slumped on this one.
SSP depends on length of service. Actually, you're entitled to SSP from day one if you're an employee. So obviously you have to get the eligibility rights to gain SSP, be off for a certain amount of days, but yes, everyone is entitled to it. Right, I'm sure everyone knows this. Can employees include discretionary decisions? I've said it a few times, so I'm hoping you're going to get this right. Yes, they can, as long as you're not discriminating or breaking legislation. Which legal body sets the minimum standards for employee policies, particularly things like disciplinary and maternity, paternity? What is the legal body? If you're ever stuck, you need to go. ACAS, correct. So ACAS is the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. You can find them on Google. If you want help with a policy, or you want to know what the minimum standards are, ACAS can do that. You can phone them, or they have a website, and also www.gov.uk will also have a lot of that information. But with ACAS, if you ended up in a tribunal and you didn't have a policy, the tribunal would look at whether you did the minimum of what ACAS say you can do. So you may do enhanced things, but if you don't do the minimum of what ACAS say you must do, that is what they will measure you against should you end up in a tribunal. Right, handbook and policies, can it be updated any time? I have said that. Yes, they can. Are employees legally entitled to request copies of handbooks and policies? They are legally entitled. I would also say, as best practice, you should definitely give them, but please never do a formal meeting as a disciplinary or an absence or a capability without giving the employer a copy of the policy you're about to follow. Can an employee be dismissed for high absence, irrelevant of what the reason is? Pretty much. There might be the odd cases, but pretty much you can be dismissed for high absence. Can I create a policy on any subject? Yes, you can, but like I said, common sense prevails. Just think about the subject, but pretty much, yeah, there's no hard and fast rules on what you can create a policy on, and there will often be company specific ones. Who is responsible in an organization for employee policies? And by responsible, I mean, ultimately, if there was ever an issue or a problem, who would they go back to saying this person has accountability for the policies? Yeah, the CEO. Particularly small companies, it is going to be the company director, the CEO, but ultimately it will be that person who ends up standing up in the tribunal, which is why I always say get their buy-in with whatever policy you write. It's very rare they're ever going to bring in the person that wrote the policy. It's usually going to be the top level. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, induction and introduction to the business. Is an induction program necessary? My answer to that is, I think it is. I think it adds value to you as an organization. It helps settle the employees in quickly. It integrates them into the team. It allows them to understand your values, your cultures, makes them feel supported and become productive much, much quicker, and to work to their highest potential. I would always recommend an induction program. What it looks like is how it fits with your company, but I think it's important to do it. So what would I say one should actually cover? Next slide, please. Okay, if we start with the pink box on the left, the meet and greet. So if you're doing an induction program, it sounds really basic, but you need to let the employees know who their colleagues are, who their manager are, who is, introduce them to the different people. Everyone hates first day, you don't know anyone, and you feel a bit lost. So this is, some of it is quite basic. The amenities, you'd be amazed that they say there's your desk, but you don't know where the toilets are, the kitchen, and any of those things, or any breakout rooms or any staff rooms. The organisation overview, I think it's always nice to just be able to at least see an organisation chart or understand how, depending on the size of the company, the different departments linking together, who works for who, different managers, etc. I think these are the bits that are really quite fundamental. The contractual terms, so how do you book holiday when you first join a company? How do you report if you're sick? It's all the things that are often in your contract of employment, but it's the basics of getting through each day. The working environment, so that is the code of conduct, as I call it, the actual working culture. So, can you go to lunch whenever you want? Do so many people have to be in the office? What's the dress code? Do you have a dress down Friday? Are you allowed to wear casual wear? Are you allowed to use PCs at lunchtime for your own personal use? Can you use the work phones to make personal phone calls? It's your expectations and standards of how you run the company. Health and safety, that's a biggie. Everyone must do the basic health and safety. What happens if there's a fire alarm? Where's the first aid kits? Who's responsible for fire drills? Where they need to go? Anything, and obviously depending on the company you have, if there's more health and safety than that. So if you are working with PPE equipment and PPE clothing, they must ensure that they've got all of that. Or if you're working in an area where there's more risks, they need to go through a more intense health and safety program. I would say at our HR, we actually do not, this is the only policy that we do not write. We do not write health and safety policies. I would say they must always be written by a health and safety qualified professional. I would not want to be writing what should happen in the case of a fire or anything more serious, or if there was any sort of fumes. I am not qualified to do that, and we do not write that. We have associates that can write these policies, but we don't write them ourselves. Just in the chat bar, do people actually write their own health and safety policies, or do they use professionals? Good, I'm glad you don't. This is the big no-no, because obviously as well, health and safety, if you get it wrong, someone has an accident, you're paying big money and you will be held liable. There are more rules on health and safety than anything else, and it's the one you must be really, really careful of. And we have construction health and safety qualified staff, so yeah, that's absolutely fine. So depend on who you are, the industry you have, then it's the one that office staff, there'll be probably a small health and safety policy. If you're more in construction or some of the blue collar areas that we deal with, that's a lot more detailed policies that are written by someone who comes in, who does regular inspections. And I would say induction program is the time to ensure that you roll out your handbook and all your policies. And it's a time to capture that they've read and understood it. Any questions on that? No. Okay. So what should we avoid? This is the question. Induction can be a bit overwhelming when you first go in on day one. So try not to just throw information and they're just sat there like after like 3 hours of being spoken at and no interaction at all. It is quite overwhelming on the first day, and it is overload of information. Presentations at the appropriate level. Get the right people to do the presentations. One person doing it all day who sometimes doesn't know about the subject matters is quite dull. The rules change slightly, and now a lot of induction programs are not face-to-face, they're online, which is obviously quite difficult because you're not interacting it and getting to know people. But you need to have a look who the audience are, and are they going to be mainly office based? Are they senior level management? Are they administrators? Are they shop floor workers? And pitch it at the level that's right for them. Like I said, we've had it before where we've had employees who cannot access and do things on the computer, and we have to deal with it very, very differently than those who are happy to just be self-driven through an app. So like I said, it needs to be a shared process. It shouldn't just be HR doing all of it. It is good when other managers from other areas can come in and give some input and put some real life to it. I would say, don't create this program which oversells the job and oversells the company. Be realistic and sell who you are and what you can do. creating one that only focuses on admin, but then you don't talk about the values. I'm quite big on values and culture, and I think if I was a business owner, that's what's important to me. I want people to, I'm passionate about my company. I want people to be passionate, and I want people to want to work for me. How will they know what I'm passionate about if I don't tell them what the values of the company are? Also, if you then suddenly find you have square peg round hole, if you've never sold the values and what the ethics of the company are, then you will end up employing the wrong people. When we do recruitment, we do look at competences of people's behaviors. You can often train people to do jobs. You can't change some of the people's behaviors. And if they are the wrong fit, it is a costly mistake. And the obvious one, don't wait too long after an employee has started, because they probably learned everything they should have, or they've muddled their way through, or actually then it's just a tick box process. Next slide, please. Okay, so induction paperwork. This obviously, induction programs can look like whatever you want them to look like. They can be paper-driven, presentation written, but this is some of the paper I would recommend that you should cover during it. So we always have a checklist to show what we've gone through with the employee during their induction. So you'd expect them to have completed some form of new starter forms. That may be done the minute that you've employed them and they've done it and they brought it with them, but you need all the payroll details, the addresses, the next of kins, all of those information. You'd be amazed that we had a client where they had no next of kin details and they just didn't turn up for work and we couldn't get hold of the person at all. It sounds really basic, but sometimes these things get overlooked. A welcome pack, that could be just as simple as an introduction to the company. And so this is the opportunity for you to sell your company to your people. Medical forms. This was covered, I believe, in the previous one, I think, where medical forms, you need to be careful on what you do ask people. So please don't ask pages and pages of, have you got asthma? Do you wear glasses? And have you ever had a bad back? And do you ever suffer from kidney problems? Those sorts of things are probably not necessary to ask. If there are job specific ones, so if it was a manual handling job, you may ask if they are okay to lift it. But what you could be questioning is that, why are you asking extreme personal details? It's good to have a generic medical form to maybe bring up, but I would say employees do not have to share their pure medical details with you. So this has happened in tribunals before, where employees have not shared it. They do not have to divulge all their personal information. Then something's come to light and they say it's actually personal information, it hasn't got to be shared. It's often beneficial. So for example, if someone was an epileptic, it may be in their best interest if, as an employer, you knew, because if they did have a seizure or a fit or an episode, you would know how to treat it or what action to take. But bear in mind, people do not have to divulge personal information that's to do with their medical life. Has anyone ever had a problem or any concerns about that small area there? No. Good. Okay, moving on. IT equipment. If you're so if you're going to give out IT equipment, then this is the time to do it in induction, whether that you're issuing company phones or laptops, or whether that may be, and also what all the login processes are. That's always a minefield when you get all these different logins and all these passwords. It's the right time to ensure that they know what they should be doing with their equipment, who can use their equipment. It's quite important at the moment. There are a lot of people still working from home. Out of interest, for people that have staff that are working from home, have you all carried out a risk assessment working from home form for those people? Okay, so there was a no. Right, just to let you know, if you have an employee who's working from home and you've not carried out a risk assessment, even if it's ad hoc, or if it's permanent, if there was ever a problem, you still could be held liable. So it's just to ensure that the same standards are maintained. So we have a working from home policy, which will explain what your expectations are, how much you expect them to work, how they working from home can't be used when you've got a small child to look after, etc., etc. So we've got a policy which covers that. People shouldn't use the equipment, it should be safe. But then there's also the risk assessment, which covers around the working station. What you don't want is a claim from Mr. Employee who says, my desk and my chair was inappropriate. My employer never asked, and because I'm working from home, I've now got RSI, or I've now got a bad back. That does happen. Or you can get glasses claimed. So it seems quite simple, but it's a protection from you. It's a form where the employee fills it out, identifies anything. If it's all ticked where there are no issues and they've ticked that there's no concerns or they've not raised anything, it does protect you. What if the working from home is optional, so it's the employee's choice? I would still always recommend, if you have anyone working from home, even if it's ad hoc, short term, their choice, you do a risk assessment form. It's rare something will come out in that form, but it's important to do it. Is it basically the standard DSE? No, it's slightly different from DSE. It takes into account the whole working environment. It also covers things like the confidentiality of all your equipment, your paperwork, that side of it as well. It protects the employer as much as the employee. One thing as well, from what I would do after the end of any induction, I would always evaluate the process. So whether that's a simple form which says, did they find it beneficial? What did they learn? This is your chance to be able to mold and make the induction add value, because you can design anything and think it's wonderful and it's really hitting the mark, but until you get the feedback, you actually don't know whether it's things. So I would say, don't be afraid to evaluate, and please don't take it personally if it's not too positive, the feedback, because it's learning and you can change and you can mold it. At the end of the day, this is your first opportunity with these employees. It's the time to set the highest standards and make the best impression possible. So evaluate is absolutely crucial. Next slide, please. Okay. Who should attend an induction program? All new employees. Correct. I would say everyone should. Even if you've got people temporary on a temporary contract for 6 months, they still should be attending an induction. So I'd say yes, correct. All new employees. Is it a legal requirement to have an induction program? No, it's not. Only the health and safety part is. So you must have carried out certain health and safety elements depending on the organisation, depending on the role, but no, it's not a legal requirement, correct. Ideally, when should it happen? Yeah, correct, as soon as possible. I would say if you can get it, I would try and do it in the first week. It can be the first day, but that might be it just depends, but you need to be doing it in the first week of someone joining. And what form of media can you use to carry out the induction program? Yeah, Kate, you're correct. Any form of media, whatever works best for your organization and more importantly, for the people attending. Are there any pitfalls of not having an induction? Yeah, There are lots. You're correct. There are lots. And yes, they do feel undervalued. If you just go, you are day one, there's your desk, get on with your job. It's about first impressions. It does take them longer to understand and learn things. It is the negative impression more than anything. And it's not seen as professional, but yes, there are lots of pitfalls. And obviously I've called it induction all the way through. There are a couple of other terminologies that people use for it. Does anyone know what they are? Onboarding is one. Yeah. There's one more that is used, but not as much. Orientation, that's the two. Yeah, there may be others, but those are the big ones that I know and are used. Mainly induction, but if people call it orientation and call it onboarding, then it's all the same thing. Okay, so I've covered quite a lot, and I'm quite conscious some of these subjects are quite dry, and it's like me talking at you. So this is opportunity really for you guys. Do you have questions now? Is there anything that I've gone through which you go, that really doesn't make sense? I really don't understand that. This is now the opportunity to for you to ask questions. I would say there's a couple of things I do want to share, is that I've talked a bit about detail and sometimes putting in too much detail, which would come and bite you on the bum when you write a policy. Here's a couple of examples, true examples of policies. So I've seen in a travel policy where it said, you must not use your company mobile phone whilst driving, even with a hands-free kit. If you receive or make a mobile telephone call whilst driving, you should stop the car in a safe place, turn off the engine, and then make and receive the call once satisfied it's safe to do so. That's masses of detail. I understand hands-free shouldn't be encouraged, but that is quite an unusual standard to put in, that you must pull over and take it. I've even put in there, I've even read the one where it says, you must not make any collections from colleagues without authorization from a senior manager. So even like a collection for someone leaving, you need, I mean, to write these in a policy is pretty detailed. But there is a famous clothing brand, which is the best one, which actually says hair highlights should appear as if the hair is naturally highlighted by the sun and not manipulated by unnatural bleaching methods. And clothes should be consistent with the season. So you should only wear a heavy wool polo neck jumper in the winter, not when it's sunny. Why? I'm just like, why would you write that in a policy? So it's a bit of fun, but I'm just trying to say, common sense is the most important thing when it comes to handbooks and policies and induction. A tricky one.
Had a question like come in. The use of pronouns on name badges, email signatures, etc. It's rarely in a policy. They don't do it as they're a small community building with older employees who don't fully engage with present day gender conversations. How would you approach that, Rachel?
Right. So sorry, what can I need to turn? Sorry, I couldn't hear. Sorry, could you just repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, so Emmeline's just said that the use of pronouns on name badges and email signatures, it's rarely in a policy, and they don't use it as they're a smaller community building with older employees who don't fully engage with present day gender conversations.
Yeah.
How would you approach that?
I suppose, are people, my question is, are people finding it offensive with anything like that? Is it going to offend people? It's really difficult. It needs, I'm wary sometimes how much you write in a policy, because once it's in a policy, then everyone will go with it. So I think it's difficult to enforce something, you know, and take away the complete freedom. If it's offensive and it causes complaints, that's one thing. But if it's optional, I would try to give a bit of freedom to allow people. I try not to put that in a policy unless it is causing a big issue, because obviously, yes, you've got the difference between the ages, and sometimes it isn't one size fit all. It could be, if that's your preference to do it, but it's not mandatory.
Lovely, thank you. And somebody else has asked if there is kind of a template to access for the evaluation document for the whole environment, because they have a DSE check, but they wondered if there's another document that they can access.
Yeah, they can. I mean, you can Google them. Home working risk assessment. You could Google it. we have one. If they want to contact through yourselves, then that's fine. But yes, there's no legal template. It must include this. Some of it is common sense, but it is really important to protect yourselves, employers. So yes, yes, they can contact yourselves, or you can try to Google a home working risk assessment form, and you will probably find quite a few templates on there if you want to cut and paste bits. I'm trying to think of these people, where it isn't going to cost money. They will find free stuff on the internet if they want to use it.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to follow up on the pronouns question, everybody's kind of in agreement that it's optional, and that you should kind of do it on an ad hoc basis for those who want to.
Yeah, because I think the minute you start to put "you must" in policies, if people, it's not right for them, then is it something that's going to really be a deal breaker? Then no, it's not. Then don't put it in. I'm also, like I said, repeating, often use the word "may" in a policy. You may face a disciplinary, not you will be in a disciplinary. May is the best grey discretion word you can use for anything, and it helps you. It still allows you to have that flexibility and freedom to manage situations. Any more? With anything like this, like I said, if people remember a question later on, or they have something which is more specific or more personal that they may not want to put in the chat bar, they can obviously direct the questions through yourselves, and I'm quite happy to provide an answer back from that point of view. That's not a problem at all.
That's great, thank you, Rachel. We'll put up the contact details again at the end of the session. So yeah, if there's any questions that you'd rather take offline, then get in touch, it'd be great. Is
there anything that people were expecting this to cover that I haven't covered, and they have a generic question which isn't within the content? Because I'm happy to answer that as well.
If anybody wants to come off mute to ask your question, that's great.
Okay.
No questions coming in, just a lot of thank yous, and it's been very helpful.
Thank you. No, like I said, I'm more than happy to pick anything else up. I'm just conscious, obviously, handbooks and policies can be the extremely driest subject, and it's hard to make it interesting, but I can re-emphasize how important it is to have something and have it right. So even if there are questions later on, please do send them forward. I'm more than happy to pick anything up, and there's never a daft question. I live and breathe this. Is all up here, so there is never a daft question. Getting this right is so important, and it's better to ask, and then we can help you.